The night Homelander snapped was not the night the world ended. It was the night something older answered. In downtown Manhattan, a hijacked Vought transport tore through traffic before detonating, sending SUPs and civilians screaming into fire and glass. Homelander descended to make a statement, heat vision carving wreckage apart, when the smoke began moving against the wind. From the crater, shadows stacked into a man-shaped absence, eyes burning red through the ash. Alucard did not announce himself. He walked through Homelander's lasers as if they were rain, flesh tearing, knitting, laughing. The first punch cracked the street for 3 blocks. Cameras caught Homelander being driven backward, boots plowing trenches, his grin collapsing into disbelief. Soldiers opened fire. The bullets never landed. They bent, screamed, and returned. Vought's feeds cut. Sirens drowned. Something ancient smiled in America's brightest city. And as Homelander rose, furious and bleeding for the first time, one question spread faster than panic. What happens when the apex predator of this world meets a monster that cannot die? If power were real and mercy optional, who would you become to survive tonight? Stay with the story, decide with the world, and subscribe if you want to see where this choice leads when gods bleed and monsters don't hear. The first thing Vought lost was control of the footage. That alone would have been survivable. Leaks happened. Servers burned. PR teams buried bodies every week. What made this night different was that every live camera in Midtown caught the same impossible sequence before the blackout hit, and millions of people saw it at the same time. A hijacked armored transport exploded near Bryant Park. Homelander arrived to clean it up, and something walked out of the fire that refused to die. Homelander descended fast and loud, cape snapping in the shockwave of his landing, already smiling for cameras that hadn't cut yet. He spoke a single line about safety and consequences before heat vision lanced through the smoke, carving a glowing trench across the street. Normally that was the end of things. This time, the beam hit a silhouette and kept going, cutting buildings behind it, until Homelander realized the figure was still standing where it had been. The smoke moved backward, sucked inward like a held breath. A tall man stepped forward in a red coat that should have burned off seconds ago. His face was pale, eyes glowing like coals under ash. Homelander adjusted midair, narrowed his eyes and fired again, longer this time, pushing power into it. The beam tore through flesh, burned through bone, and for half a second the man's torso was simply gone. Then it grew back. The regeneration wasn't flashy. It was worse. Muscle crawled over exposed ribs like insects returning to a nest. Skin followed, sealing seams that should have scarred. The man laughed, low and amused, as if Homelander had just told a joke that took a second to land. That was when Homelander stopped smiling. Ground-level Vought security finally opened fire. Rifles, mounted guns, everything they had. The bullets never reached their target. They curved in midair, crushed flat, and spun back the way they'd come, punching through armor and bodies with wet finality. Screams followed. The red-coated man kept walking, boots crunching over glass, head tilted like he was studying a particularly interesting ant farm. Homelander hit him first. The punch landed with enough force to crack the street and collapse a parking garage entrance. For a moment, the man disappeared into the crater. Homelander hovered above it, chest heaving, eyes glowing again. He shouted something that didn't make the feeds, but everyone could read it on his face. Rage, confusion, the unthinkable realization that this wasn't ending on his terms. A hand shot out of the crater and grabbed Homelander's ankle. The grip didn't crush bone. It didn't need to. It held. Homelander tried to pull away and failed, dragged down as the figure hauled itself up, coat shredded now, body stitched together and whole again. They slammed into the pavement together, trading blows that shattered storefronts and sent shockwaves rolling down the block. Homelander's strength was real, brutal, and overwhelming by any human standard. It still wasn't enough to put this thing down. Inside Vought Tower, screens went red as failsafes kicked in. Ashley Barrett stood frozen, hands shaking around a tablet that refused to reconnect. Someone shouted about containment protocols. Someone else screamed that Homelander's vitals were spiking in ways they'd never recorded before. Deep underground, Butcher watched the same clips on a burner phone, teeth clenched around a grin that wasn't joy so much as vindication. For the first time, Homelander looked scared. The fight rolled into the air. Homelander broke free with a surge of strength, flinging the man upward and following with heat vision, carving him apart again and again as they climbed. Each time the pieces reassembled, shadows pulling flesh back together like strings. The man didn't dodge. He didn't block. He let it happen, watching Homelander with interest, learning. When he finally struck back in earnest, it wasn't with raw force. He moved faster than the cameras could track, appearing behind Homelander mid-flight, fingers digging into the cape and ripping it away. He slammed Homelander face first through the side of a high-rise, dragging him through offices and concrete until they burst out the other side in a storm of debris. Papers rained down like snow over the city. "Stay down," Homelander roared, more command than threat now, and unleashed everything he had. For 30 seconds the sky burned. Windows melted. Steel sagged. The man was reduced to a skeleton, then less, then nothing recognizable at all. Homelander hovered, panting, eyes wide, daring the universe to defy him again. Below, people filmed with shaking hands, convinced they'd just seen the end of whatever nightmare this was. Then the darkness thickened. It pooled in the air where the man had been, congealing into mass, into limbs, into a grin that formed before the face around it finished rebuilding. Red eyes opened. The coat reformed last, settling over shoulders that rolled as if loosening up. The man looked down at the city, then back at Homelander, clearly disappointed. He spoke for the first time, voice carrying without effort over the chaos, calm and conversational, like this was a meeting that had run long rather than a battle that had flattened a neighborhood. He introduced himself as Alucard and thanked Homelander for the exercise. Homelander charged again, but this time Alucard met him head-on, catching the punch, stopping it cold. The shockwave still rippled outward, but the momentum died in Alucard's grip. He leaned in close, eyes locked on Homelander's, and for the first time, Homelander didn't look like a god. He looked like a man realizing the rules had changed. Far away in a secure room with no windows, a red phone began to ring. Vought's last resort contingency had been triggered, not for a rogue soup, not for a terrorist attack, for something they couldn't categorize at all. Alucard smiled wider, teeth too sharp, and tightened his grip as Homelander struggled. The city below held its breath as something new entered the food chain, and the strongest man in the world started to lose altitude with him. Homelander hit the street hard enough to punch a crater through 3 lanes of asphalt, and this time he didn't bounce. Alucard landed a moment later, boots touching down lightly beside the impact zone, coat fluttering as if the city itself was breathing around him. Traffic alarms wailed. Fire spread unchecked. Homelander pushed himself up on one arm, blood on his face, and stared at the thing that had dragged him out of the sky like he weighed nothing at all. For the first time in his life, Homelander did not know what to say. He attacked anyway, not because it was smart, but because it was the only response his identity allowed. He surged forward, grappling, trying to tear Alucard apart with raw strength, smashing him through cars and concrete barriers. Alucard let himself be thrown, let bones snap and organs rupture, only to rise again every time, body reassembling with lazy inevitability. Each regeneration took a fraction longer than the last, not because it struggled, but because Alucard seemed to enjoy drawing it out. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett finally found her voice, and it came out as a scream. Orders flew across the command floor, overlapping and contradicting each other. Evacuation zones were expanded. Media blackouts were enforced. Vought news anchors were fed lines about a foreign bioterror asset while technicians desperately tried to isolate what exactly Alucard was. Every database search came back empty. No compound V signature. No known physiology. No limits. Someone suggested deploying the 7. Ashley shut that down immediately, not out of strategy but fear. Homelander was already bleeding on live camera feeds they couldn't fully suppress. Sending more subs into that mess risked turning a disaster into a massacre. Still, as Homelander was dragged screaming through another storefront, she realized the decision might already be out of her hands. Across the city, Billy Butcher watched from a stolen rooftop vantage point, binoculars steady despite the chaos. Huey stood behind him, pale and shaking, trying not to flinch every time Homelander hit the ground. Butcher didn't smile this time. The grin from earlier had faded into something sharper, more calculating. He didn't know what Alucard was, but he knew what he did. He made Homelander bleed. That alone rewrote the board. "This ain't normal," Huey muttered. "No," Butcher agreed, "but it's bloody useful." On the street, the fight shifted. Homelander took to the air again, grabbing Alucard and rocketing upward, slamming him repeatedly into the sides of buildings as they climbed. He was faster now, angrier, trying to overwhelm regeneration with sheer repetition. Alucard's body tore apart again and again, pieces scattering, but the shadows followed, pulling him back together even as Homelander hurled what was left of him into the sky. At the apex of their climb, Homelander threw Alucard straight up, then hovered, eyes blazing. He waited until Alucard reached the peak of his arc and fired everything he had, a sustained blast that turned clouds into steam and burned a hole through the night sky. For a full 10 seconds, there was nothing left of Alucard but drifting ash. Homelander hovered there, chest heaving, eyes darting, waiting for the regeneration that had followed every other attack. When it didn't come immediately, something like hope flickered across his face. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. The ash fell upward. Darkness condensed above Homelander, coiling into wings that weren't wings at all, more suggestion than substance. Alucard reformed upside down, hanging in the air as if gravity had been reassigned. He dropped without warning, slamming into Homelander with enough force to send them both plummeting. They hit the street again, deeper this time, collapsing a subway entrance and sending a shockwave that knocked people off their feet 6 blocks away. Alucard stood first. He looked down at Homelander, genuinely curious now, and asked him how long he thought this could last. That was when Vought escalated. The order came through encrypted channels, bypassing half a dozen internal safeguards. Heavy response units were greenlit. Experimental weapons were authorized. A military convoy that had been waiting just outside the city rerouted toward Midtown, carrying things Vought had sworn would never see deployment on American soil. Ashley signed off on all of it with shaking hands, knowing that if this failed, there would be no one left to blame but her. The first missiles hit 5 minutes later. They weren't aimed at Alucard, they were aimed at the block. Explosions ripped through the street, engulfing Homelander and Alucard alike in fire and debris. Buildings collapsed. A shockwave shattered windows across Manhattan. For a moment, even the cameras went dark, overwhelmed by the blast. When the feeds came back, the street was gone, replaced by a smoking crater filled with twisted metal and burning wreckage. Homelander crawled out of it, coughing, clothes torn, skin blistered but healing. He looked around wildly, searching for Alucard, fear finally breaking through his anger. For one terrible second, it seemed like the missiles had worked. Then the crater began to move. Blood seeped up through the rubble, pooling, spreading, forming shapes. Hands pushed through concrete. Laughter echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alucard rose from the destruction like the blast had been an inconvenience, not an attack, body whole, eyes brighter than before. Homelander staggered back, shaking his head, refusing to accept what he was seeing. Alucard took a step toward him, and this time Homelander flinched. High above, a drone captured the moment from a perfect angle, the world's strongest suit retreating, just one step, from something that did not acknowledge the concept of defeat. The clip would be scrubbed, buried, denied. It would still leak. As sirens closed in and more weapons were prepared, Alucard looked past Homelander, past the burning city, toward the tower that thought it controlled this world. His smile widened not with hunger but with intent. This wasn't a fight anymore, it was a declaration. Vought did what it always did when it lost control of the narrative. It tried to bury the truth under procedure. By sunrise, Midtown Manhattan was sealed off behind concrete barriers and armed checkpoints. Official statements blamed a Compound V, enhanced extremist asset for the destruction, insisting Homelander had neutralized the threat at great cost to the city. The footage of Homelander retreating was flagged as foreign disinformation. The crater was classified. The dead were folded into existing numbers. On paper, the incident was already over. In reality, Alucard was still standing in the ruins. He hadn't pursued Homelander when the Soup fled the blast zone. That decision unsettled Vought more than anything else. Monsters that rampaged could be studied. Forces that chose restraint were harder to predict. Thermal scans showed Alucard moving slowly through the quarantine district, examining damage like a tourist in a war museum. He didn't attack soldiers. He didn't flee. He simply existed, and every sensor struggled to track him consistently, readings spiking and vanishing without pattern. Ashley Barrett convened a closed-door emergency session with Vought's highest-ranking executives and military liaisons. No press, no heroes, just people who understood what it meant to lose a monopoly on power. The room reeked of fear dressed up as authority. Options were thrown around in rapid succession: containment foam, sonic suppression, orbital assets, but every proposal ran into the same wall. Nothing they deployed had slowed him. Nothing suggested there was a ceiling to what he could endure. That was when someone finally said the word capture. Not kill, capture. If Alucard couldn't be destroyed, then he could be studied, dissected, weaponized. Vought's entire empire was built on that logic. Ashley hated it, but she signed off anyway. The alternative was admitting they were no longer the apex force on the planet. The plan was simple in theory and catastrophic in execution. They lured him. A fabricated evacuation failure was broadcast across emergency channels, directing stranded civilians toward a supposedly secure underground shelter beneath an abandoned financial building. Alucard arrived within minutes, drawn by the noise, the fear, the unmistakable scent of blood from actors who didn't know how little protection they actually had. He stepped into the entrance just as the doors slammed shut behind him. What followed was the most expensive trap Vought had ever sprung. Containment fields flared to life, flooding the chamber with energy designed to disrupt nervous systems and regenerate resistant tissues. Specialized units flooded the corridors, firing rounds laced with experimental compounds meant to inhibit healing. Sonic cannons shook the walls. For the first time since his arrival, Alucard stopped moving. For 12 seconds, Vought thought it had worked. Then Alucard laughed. The sound didn't travel through the air. It traveled through the structure itself, vibrating steel and concrete, resonating in the chests of everyone watching from behind bulletproof glass. Alucard straightened, his form flickering as if the fields were struggling to decide where he ended and the shadows began. Bullets hit him and stayed lodged for a moment before being pushed out by regenerating flesh, clattering uselessly to the floor. He walked forward. Containment units opened fire in panic. Alucard moved through them like a tide, bodies torn apart by forces that didn't leave clean wounds. This wasn't the blunt destruction of Homelander's heat vision. It was intimate, deliberate, almost surgical. Alucard killed quickly, efficiently, and without spectacle, as if the people in front of him were obstacles, not enemies. By the time he reached the control room, the trap was already collapsing. Above ground, Homelander watched the feeds from a secure Vought facility, jaw clenched so tightly his teeth creaked. He didn't speak. He didn't posture. He stared at Alucard tearing through elite units that were supposed to support him, and something fundamental shifted behind his eyes. This wasn't a rival Soup. This wasn't even a weapon. This was proof that the rules he'd been raised on were a lie. For the first time, Homelander considered the possibility that he was replaceable. In the ruins outside the containment site, Billy Butcher and Huey listened to police scanners crackle with reports that didn't match the official story. Butcher's contacts were screaming. Vought was deploying assets it had hidden for decades. Something had gone wrong at a level even they couldn't spin away. Butcher didn't know Alucard's endgame, but he knew chaos when he saw it, and chaos was opportunity. "Whatever that thing is," Huey said quietly, "they can't control it." Butcher smirked. "No," he agreed, "and that scares him more than us." Inside the shattered facility, Alucard finally stopped. He stood alone amid wreckage and bodies, head tilted, listening. He could feel it now, the weight of the world pressing in, the eyes watching from satellites and screens, the quiet desperation of people who thought power could be owned. He looked directly at a surviving camera and spoke calmly, clearly, like a man addressing a boardroom rather than a battlefield. He told them this place was not a cage. He told them he had not come to be owned. And he told them with a smile that showed too many teeth that the next move was theirs. The feed cut instantly. Across the city, Vought's emergency systems began to fail in cascading waves. Power grids flickered. Secure lines went dead. Someone, somewhere, pulled a final contingency file that hadn't been opened since the Cold War. A name surfaced in classified briefings, attached to weapons no one wanted to acknowledge. Homelander stood alone in his viewing room as the lights dimmed, fists clenched, cape draped uselessly over his shoulders. Outside, the city held its breath again. Vought had tried to contain the impossible. Now it had to decide how far it was willing to go to survive what it had unleashed. By the time night fell again, Manhattan no longer felt like a city protected by superheroes. It felt occupied. Armored vehicles blocked bridges. Helicopters patrolled low, searchlights cutting through smoke that never fully cleared. Vought-branded relief stations handed out water and talking points in equal measure, insisting the situation was under control while quietly evacuating executives through private tunnels. People believed the lie because the alternative was admitting that the Seven had failed, and that belief had been the city's only comfort for years. Alucard moved through it all unseen, not because he hid, but because no system could agree on where he was. Cameras caught him on one street while drones tracked heat signatures 2 blocks away. Acoustic sensors picked up footsteps where no body registered. He didn't rush. He didn't hunt. He let the city show him what it did when it thought its gods were watching and then realized they were. Looting began before midnight. Not desperate, not chaotic, but methodical. Banks, pharmacies, Vought-affiliated storefronts. The illusion of order peeled back layer by layer, and the police pulled back as soon as they realized no soup was coming to back them up. Every emergency call went unanswered. Every siren sounded smaller than it had the night before. On a rooftop overlooking Times Square, Homelander hovered alone, invisible to the people below who were too busy arguing and running to look up. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes darting constantly as if expecting Alucard to rise out of the concrete beneath his feet. He could hear everything: sirens, screams, the low murmur of a city losing faith, and for the first time it didn't feel like adoration. It felt like accusation. Ashley Barrett's voice crackled through his earpiece, clipped and rehearsed. Vought wanted him to make a statement, a show of force, something definitive. Homelander didn't answer. He was still replaying the moment his punch had stopped dead in Alucard's hand, the way certainty had drained out of him in that instant. Power had always been simple before. Now it felt conditional. He descended anyway. Homelander landed in Times Square with calculated precision, crushing the hood of an abandoned car. The crowd recoiled instantly, instinct overriding distrust. Cameras came out. He straightened, smiled, and delivered the speech Vought had fed him almost word for word. He promised safety. He promised justice. He promised that the threat had been neutralized. A bottle hit him in the chest. It bounced off harmlessly, but the sound echoed louder than any applause ever had. Someone shouted that he was lying. Someone else screamed that he'd run. The crowd surged, not toward him but away, and Homelander felt something snap. He took to the air in a flash of rage, heat vision, carving a line across a digital billboard just to remind them who he was. That was when the shadows moved. Alucard stepped out of the dark beneath the screens, coat immaculate despite the ash, eyes fixed on Homelander with open amusement. The crowd didn't see him at first. They felt him. The temperature dropped. The noise dulled. Phones glitched. Homelander froze midair, blood rushing in his ears as every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Alucard didn't attack. He raised a hand, and the streetlights around Times Square burst one by one, plunging the plaza into a red-lit half-dark cast by emergency signage. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice calm, almost polite. He thanked Homelander for keeping the city warm. He suggested that perhaps it was time to see how it fared without him. The crowd finally noticed. Panic erupted as people ran in every direction, trampling each other to escape a confrontation they didn't understand. Homelander dove, fists clenched, tackling Alucard through a storefront and into the building behind it. Glass and concrete exploded outward as they tore through floors, trading blows that shattered support beams and sent the structure sagging. This fight was different. Homelander wasn't holding back anymore. He fought like an animal cornered, every strike meant to end it, every blast poured on longer than before. Alucard absorbed it all, body breaking and reforming, shadows thickening around him, movements growing more precise with each exchange. He wasn't just enduring Homelander's power. He was adapting to it. They burst back out onto the street in a storm of debris. Homelander slammed Alucard into the pavement again and again, trying to pulp him into nothing. Alucard finally caught his arm, twisted, and threw Homelander through a city bus, sending it skidding end over end down the block. For a moment, Homelander lay still, buried under twisted metal. Alucard stood over the wreckage, breathing steady, eyes scanning the city. He could feel the shift now, the moment where belief cracked. People weren't watching Homelander anymore. They were watching him, waiting to see which monster would claim the night. Homelander exploded out of the wreckage with a scream, launching himself at Alucard in a final, desperate charge. They collided midair, crashing into the side of a skyscraper and clinging there, trading blows as glass rained down like hail. Alucard leaned in close enough that Homelander could see his reflection in those red eyes. "This city doesn't need gods," Alucard told him calmly. "It needs to know they can bleed." He let go. Homelander fell. He caught himself inches from the street, hovering shakily, chest heaving, eyes wild. Alucard remained on the building's side, watching him with something that might have been pity. Sirens wailed in the distance as Vought forces closed in, too late to matter. Above them something else moved. Not Alucard, not Homelander. A shadow passed across the clouds, massive and deliberate, accompanied by a distant mechanical roar. Vought's final escalation was arriving, and it wasn't subtle. Alucard looked up, smile returning, as the city realized the night was far from over. The shadow over Manhattan did not belong to a god. It belonged to a machine. Vought's classified response platform cut through the clouds with a sound that rattled windows miles away, its silhouette vast and unmistakably military. Twin rotors the size of city buses churned the air, armored hull bristling with weapon systems that had never appeared in any shareholder report. This was not a soup. This was not a hero. This was what Vought built when it decided people were cheaper than restraint. Alucard watched it descend with interest, head tilted, eyes tracking every movement. Homelander hovered lower now, instinctively backing away from the platform as it took position over Midtown. The fact that Vought had deployed it without consulting him landed harder than any punch Alucard had thrown. For the first time, he wasn't the final answer. He was just another asset in the blast radius. The first strike wasn't aimed at Alucard. It hit the street between them. The explosion swallowed cars, storefronts, and the pavement itself. a controlled detonation designed to separate targets and clear civilians who hadn't already fled. Shockwaves rolled outward, flipping vehicles and knocking Homelander off balance midair. Alucard was thrown back into the shadow of a collapsed building, his body tearing apart under the force before reforming almost lazily in the settling dust. Then the platform locked onto him. Kinetic rounds the size of refrigerators screamed down from above, each impact punching craters into the street and forcing Alucard to the ground. Missile pods followed, saturating the area with fire and fragmentation. The air filled with smoke so thick it blotted out the skyline. From the outside, it looked like overkill. From inside Vought's command bunker, it was desperation masquerading as confidence. Ashley Barrett watched the feeds with white-knuckled focus, flanked by generals who spoke in acronyms and casualty estimates. This wasn't about Manhattan anymore. It was about precedent. If Alucard survived this, every government on Earth would know Vought couldn't protect its monopoly. The platform fired again and again, emptying magazines that had been built for wars that never happened. When the smoke cleared, the street was gone. There was a pit where Times Square had been, edges glowing with heat, rubble sliding inward as if the ground itself wanted to forget what had happened there. Homelander hovered at a safe distance, eyes scanning for movement, praying he wouldn't see it. For a long, awful moment, there was nothing. Then the pit moved. Blood flowed up the crater walls like a tide revering, pooling at the center and rising into shape. Alucard emerged slowly, deliberately, body reforming piece by piece, coat knitting itself back together as if insulted by the damage. The wounds from the bombardment sealed with audible snaps, bones sliding back into place. He looked up at the platform, expression unreadable. The platform fired again. This time, Alucard moved. He vanished as the rounds hit, reappearing atop a wrecked streetlight an instant later, then on the side of a nearby building, then closer, each jump defying the sensors trying to track him. Weapons struggled to lock on as he closed the distance faster than the targeting systems could compensate. Alucard leapt, clearing dozens of meters in a single bound, landing on the platform's hull with a sound like a hammer striking steel. Inside the cockpit, alarms screamed. The crew barely had time to react before Alucard tore into the hull with bare hands, metal screaming as it was peeled back like tin. He reached inside, not to kill immediately, but to disable, ripping cables free and crushing control systems with precise brutality. The platform lurched, rotors faltering, weapons firing wildly into the night as control was lost. Homelander stared, frozen, as the machine that had replaced him began to die. The platform crashed into a cluster of buildings, rotors shredding concrete before snapping entirely. The impact shook the city again, sending another wave of destruction outward. Alucard rode the wreckage down, stepping off as it collapsed into flames, walking away as if explosions were background noise. For the first time, the world responded. International feeds lit up with emergency sessions. Governments that had tolerated Vought's influence suddenly saw the cost of letting a corporation control gods and weapons alike. Fighter jets were scrambled. Naval assets were repositioned. Satellites shifted their focus from borders to Manhattan. Whatever Alucard was, he had become a global problem in a matter of hours. On a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly, jaw set. He'd spent years dreaming of the moment Homelander lost his grip on the world. He hadn't imagined it would come like this, with something worse stepping into the vacuum. Huey looked sick, eyes glued to the burning wreckage of the platform. "This is getting out of hand," Huey said. Butcher didn't answer. He was watching Alucard turn toward Homelander again, posture relaxed, unhurried. This wasn't a battlefield to him. It was a demonstration. Homelander gathered himself, rage and humiliation warring behind his eyes. He charged, faster than before, slamming into Alucard with enough force to level what was left of the block. They crashed through rubble, grappling, heat vision flaring at point-blank range. Alucard took it, endured it, then drove a fist into Homelander's gut that knocked the air out of him and sent him skidding across the ground. Alucard loomed over him, shadows curling thicker now, shapes moving within them that suggested something vast and restrained. He hadn't shown this much of himself before. He was escalating not to win but to be understood. Above them, jets roared overhead, weapons hot, pilots receiving authorization codes they'd never expected to use. The world had decided it could no longer wait for Vought to fix its mess. Alucard looked up at the sound, red eyes reflecting the approaching lights, and smiled like someone welcoming guests. Homelander pushed himself up, bloodied and furious, caught between a monster that wouldn't die and a world that no longer trusted him to protect it. The night cracked open as the first international missiles armed themselves, and Manhattan became the center of a conflict that no longer belonged to any one nation. The sky over Manhattan stopped belonging to anyone. Fighter jets cut across the clouds in tight formations, their transponders dark, their pilots operating under joint emergency authority that bypassed normal chains of command. These weren't Vought assets. These were state weapons, launched by governments that had spent decades pretending superheroes made traditional militaries obsolete. Tonight proved that assumption wrong, and every nation with the capacity to project force wanted a say in how this ended. Homelander felt it immediately. The airspace he had always treated as an extension of himself was suddenly hostile. Targeting radars brushed against him like cold fingers, painting him as just another variable in a kill zone. He shot upward instinctively, trying to reassert dominance, but the jets adjusted formation without hesitation, missile locks tracking his movement as easily as Alucard's. Alucard watched it all with quiet fascination. He stood in the ruins of Times Square, head tilted back, eyes following contrails weaving across the night. He could hear the pilots' heartbeats through the hulls of their aircraft, could taste the fear and adrenaline bleeding into the air. This wasn't like Vought's response. This wasn't about ownership. This was about elimination. The first missiles launched in a coordinated salvo. They didn't target the street. They targeted the space around Alucard, creating a lattice of explosions designed to shred anything caught within it. Fire blossomed in the sky, shockwaves slamming into nearby buildings and flattening what little remained standing. Homelander was thrown aside by the blast pressure, tumbling end over end before catching himself, disoriented and furious. Alucard was erased. For nearly a full minute, there was nothing where he had been but fire and debris raining down over the city. Jets circled, readying follow-up strikes. Command centers around the world held their breath, waiting for confirmation that the impossible had finally been made finite. Then the explosion stopped moving outward. The fire folded inward, pulled toward a single point like a storm collapsing into its own eye. Darkness swallowed the light, coiling into a sphere that hovered above the cratered street. Alucard emerged from it slowly, unharmed, shadows peeling off him like smoke. He looked almost disappointed. He vanished. One of the jets exploded midair without warning, its fuselage tearing apart from the inside as something punched through it. Another spiraled out of control seconds later, cockpit crushed, pilot never knowing what hit them. Alucard reappeared on the wing of a third aircraft, coat snapping in the wind as he leaned in and casually tore the engine free, sending it tumbling into the city below. The pilots broke formation immediately. Missiles were fired blindly now, panic creeping into disciplined movements. Alucard leapt from jet to jet, a blur of red and shadow, dismantling machines built to dominate the sky with nothing but his hands and the weight of his presence. He didn't chase those that fled. He let them run, letting fear do more damage than pursuit ever could. Homelander watched from below, horror and fury knotting in his chest. This was supposed to be his domain. Flight was the one place he'd never been challenged. Seeing Alucard move through the sky like it was just another hallway stripped that advantage away entirely. He surged upward again, screaming, colliding with Alucard midair in a shockwave that sent both of them plummeting. They crashed onto the roof of a half-collapsed tower, concrete buckling beneath them as they rolled, trading blows with reckless abandon. Homelander hit harder than he ever had, every strike fueled by the terror of becoming irrelevant. Alucard absorbed it, then answered in kind. The shadows around him thickened, solidifying into shapes that struck with him, multiplying the force of his attacks. Homelander was driven back step by step, each blow leaving deeper cracks in the rooftop, each regeneration cycle teaching Alucard more about how his opponent fought. This wasn't just endurance anymore. It was mastery. Homelander tried to disengage, blasting free with heat vision and retreating into the clouds. Alucard followed without effort, rising to meet him as if gravity had finally given up arguing. They collided again above the city, silhouettes framed by burning wreckage and fleeing aircraft. Below, the city watched. Phones recorded what no press release could erase. Homelander struggling, bleeding, losing ground in the air he'd once ruled. Faith didn't shatter all at once. It eroded, grain by grain, as people realized the man who claimed to protect them couldn't even protect himself. In a secure bunker miles away, Ashley Barrett listened to reports she could no longer control. Governments were demanding answers. Stock markets were already reacting. Vought's carefully constructed world was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing she could say to stop it. On the rooftop where Butcher stood, the wind howled with the passage of jets fleeing the city. He watched Alucard drive Homelander downward again, smashing him through the upper floors of a building in a cascade of destruction. Huey looked away, unable to stomach it anymore. "This isn't justice," Huey said quietly. "It's just worse." Butcher didn't argue. He didn't look away either. Above them all, Alucard finally stopped pressing the attack. He hovered in the ruined sky, shadows curling around him like a crown, and looked down at the city that had thrown everything it had at him and failed. He could feel the shift now, the moment when the world stopped asking how to kill him and started asking how to survive him. Homelander pulled himself from the rubble far below, body healing but spirit fractured. Eyes locked on Alucard with something dangerously close to hatred mixed with fear. The jets were gone, the platform was gone, Vought's authority was gone. And somewhere in the distance, a different kind of response was being prepared, one that didn't rely on machines or gods, but on people who had nothing left to lose. When the sky finally emptied, the silence was worse than the noise had been. Manhattan lay broken beneath a low ceiling of smoke and drifting ash, fires burning unchecked where entire blocks had been erased. The absence of jets and explosions didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. People emerged cautiously from basements and shelters, staring up at the ruined skyline and the figures still moving within it. One of those figures had once been their god. The other had never pretended to be anything but a monster. Homelander rose from the wreckage of the tower slowly, every movement deliberate, like he was afraid of what rushing might reveal. His body healed as it always did, bruises fatting, burns sealing, bones knitting back together. That part still worked. What didn't was the certainty. He felt exposed in a way no weapon had ever made him feel, stripped bare in front of a city that had watched him lose. Alucard landed across the street from him, boots touching down without a sound. The shadows around him were thicker now, restless, no longer bothering to fully retract. Something vast pressed against the edges of his form, as if he were holding a door closed with one hand. He didn't advance. He didn't need to. Homelander took a step forward anyway, jaw tight, eyes blazing. He said Alucard's name like an accusation, demanded to know what he wanted, who had sent him. The words sounded hollow even to him, recycled lines from a lifetime of staged confrontations. Alucard listened politely, head tilted, then shook his head. He told Homelander that no one had sent him. He told him this world had simply been loud enough to notice. And then, calmly, almost kindly, He asked Homelander if he understood what it meant to be feared instead of loved. The question hit harder than any blow. Around them, people watched from a distance, phones raised despite themselves. They weren't cheering. They weren't screaming. They were witnessing. Homelander felt it in his bones, the shift from awe to appraisal. He was being measured now, not adored, and he hated it. He attacked again, not with strategy but with desperation. He lunged, tackling Alucard through the remains of a diner, slamming him into the ground over and over, heat vision flaring at point-blank range. Alucard endured it, body tearing and reforming, shadows lashing out instinctively to deflect the worst of the force. This wasn't dominance anymore. It was resistance. Alucard finally pushed back, throwing Homelander off him and driving a knee into his chest that sent him skidding across the street. He followed, not rushing, every step heavy with intent. Homelander scrambled to his feet, swinging wildly, landing hits that would have ended any other fight. Alucard absorbed them, then caught Homelander by the throat and lifted him off the ground. For a moment, the city held its breath. Alucard didn't crush his windpipe. He didn't tear him apart. He held him there, eye level, and spoke quietly enough that only Homelander could hear. He told him that power without restraint was boring, that immortality without purpose was empty, and that monsters who pretended to be saviors always broke the same way when the mask cracked. He dropped Homelander. The impact shattered the street beneath him, leaving him coughing and gasping in a crater he couldn't immediately climb out of. Alucard turned away from him then, something no one had ever done in the middle of a fight with Homelander. He looked instead toward the edges of the devastation, where figures were moving with intent rather than fear. Billy Butcher stepped into the open, rifle slung over his shoulder, coat torn and face smeared with soot. Behind him came Huey, Mother's Milk, and Frenchie, weapons ready but hands shaking. They hadn't planned to be this close. The fight had come to them. Alucard regarded them with open curiosity, eyes lingering on Butcher a fraction longer than the others. He could taste the man's hatred, old and deep, sharpened by years of powerlessness. It was familiar, useful. Homelander dragged himself out of the crater and saw them too. Rage flared instantly, hotter than fear. He shouted at them to get back, to leave, to remember who he was. None of them moved. The spell was broken. The god was yelling at mortals and the mortals weren't kneeling. Butcher met Alucard's gaze and spoke first, voice steady despite the destruction around them. He didn't threaten. He didn't beg. He told Alucard exactly what Homelander was, what Vought had built, how many people had died to keep the illusion intact. He didn't ask Alucard to help. He asked him if he cared. Alucard smiled, slow and sharp. He said he didn't care about justice. He didn't care about corporations or governments or revenge. What he cared about was honesty. And this world, he said, had been lying to itself for a very long time. Homelander launched himself at them in a blur of motion, panic overriding sense. Alucard moved without looking, intercepting him mid-charge and slamming him into the ground again, harder this time. The street caved in, and Homelander lay there stunned, staring up at a sky that no longer answered him. Alucard turned back to the group, shadows settling slightly, and told them they were free to leave. He had no interest in killing them, not yet. As they backed away, alarms began to sound again, different from before. Not sirens, warnings. Somewhere deep beneath the city, something massive shifted into readiness. A final deterrent Vought had sworn would never be activated. Alucard felt it immediately and laughed, the sound echoing through the ruined streets. The men had decided to try again. The warning sirens weren't meant for civilians. They were keyed to people who understood what the sound meant, buried in classified briefings and black-budget contingency plans. The tone was flat, mechanical, repeating in intervals that carried through the ground itself. Alucard felt it resonate through the concrete beneath his boots, a low-frequency vibration designed to wake something that had never been tested outside simulations. Homelander felt it too, and this time the fear was immediate. He pushed himself upright, eyes darting toward the direction of the sound, recognition flashing across his face before he could hide it. This wasn't another platform. This wasn't an airstrike. This was the last line Vought kept for scenarios where even Homelander wasn't enough. Alucard watched him closely, nodding the shift. "Ah," he said calmly, almost pleased. "You do have a limit." The street split open 2 blocks away. Steel doors the size of buildings irised apart, revealing a subterranean shaft that plunged deeper than the subway lines. Heat poured out of it, along with the hum of something enormous spooling up. Floodlights snapped on, illuminating a figure rising from the depths, carried upward on a magnetic lift reinforced with enough armor to stop a small war. It was humanoid in shape, but nothing about it was human. Taller than a building, plated in layered alloys etched with Vought insignia, its limbs were studded with weapon systems that tracked independently. At its center glowed a core pulsing with energy that made the air shimmer. This was Vought's answer to gods, not a hero, but a verdict. Butcher stared at it from cover, mouth slightly open. "They built that," he muttered, not disbelief but grim confirmation of everything he'd suspected. Homelander backed away without realizing it, eyes fixed on the machine. He'd been told it was theoretical, a deterrent, something that existed to scare governments, not to be used. Seeing it now, active and real, he understood the truth. Vought had never trusted him completely. They just never needed the backup before. The machine's head turned, sensors locking onto Alucard instantly. A voice boomed from hidden speakers, emotionless and rehearsed, declaring the target an existential threat to global stability. Alucard listened politely, hands clasped behind his back like a man attending a lecture. Then the machine fired. Energy lanced out in a focused beam that tore through the street, vaporizing everything in its path. Alucard was caught in it head-on, his form disintegrating completely. Shadows burned away under the intensity. The beam continued for several seconds, carving a glowing trench through the city until the machine powered down, core dimming slightly as it recalibrated. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Homelander exhaled shakily, something like relief flickering across his face. Butcher didn't share it. He'd seen this story too many times. Nothing ended that cleanly. The shadows returned first. They seeped out of the scorched trench, darker than before, thicker, resisting the light rather than fleeing it. Alucard reformed slowly, deliberately, his regeneration visibly strained for the first time. The damage had meant something. It hadn't killed him, but it had hurt. His smile widened. "Oh," he said softly, "that's new." The machine adjusted its stance, recognizing escalation. Missile pods opened. Kinetic cannons spun up. Alucard moved before it could fire again, vanishing into a smear of darkness that slammed into the machine's leg with enough force to stagger it. Metal screamed as plating buckled. The machine responded instantly, bringing an arm down in a crushing blow that flattened a city block. Alucard was reduced to paste. He reformed on the machine's shoulder an instant later, tearing into sensor arrays, blinding it on one side. The machine swatted at him, movements precise and brutally efficient, each hit landing with city-level force. Alucard was torn apart again and again, regeneration lagging slightly more each time, shadows flaring brighter to compensate. This wasn't dominance. This was resistance meeting resistance. Homelander watched, paralyzed, as something finally challenged Alucard in a way he hadn't seen yet. Part of him wanted the machine to win, to erase the thing that had shattered his world. Another part recoiled at the realization that if Vought could deploy this against Alucard, it could deploy it against him. The machine adapted, switching tactics, flooding the area with suppression fields designed to disrupt whatever force animated Alucard. For a moment, the shadows thinned. Alucard stumbled, one knee hitting the ground as his regeneration slowed to a crawl. The machine raised its arm for a finishing blow. Alucard looked up at it, eyes burning brighter than they had all night, and laughed. The shadows exploded outward, no longer contained to his form. They poured into the streets, into the wreckage, into the machine itself, seeping through seams and vents like living smoke. The suppression fields flickered, overwhelmed by sheer volume. Alucard rose, not just whole again, but larger, presence swelling as if he'd finally stopped holding back. The machine struck him, and for the first time its blow didn't send him flying. Alucard caught the arm. Metal bent under his grip, servo screaming as he forced it downward. He climbed the machine's torso, tearing armor free with every step, ripping into the glowing core at its center. The machine unleashed everything it had at point-blank range, beams and rounds hammering Alucard until the street beneath them collapsed entirely. When the core detonated, the explosion swallowed them both. The blast lit up the city like a second sunrise, shockwave flattening what little remained standing. People were thrown from their feet miles away. Windows shattered across boroughs. When the light faded, the machine lay in ruins, half melted and inert, its core a smoking cavity. Alucard stood atop it, coat torn, regeneration visibly slower now, shadows still writhing around him. He had paid a price, and he didn't hide it. He looked down at Homelander, who stood frozen in the street below, staring up at the wreckage of the thing meant to replace him. Alucard spoke, voice carrying easily over the devastation. He told Homelander this was what defiance looked like, not winning without cost, but surviving it. Sirens sounded again in the distance, different this time. Evacuation, withdrawal, the world pulling back, reassessing. Homelander clenched his fists, eyes never leaving Alucard. He wasn't beaten, not yet, but something had been decided tonight, something irreversible. And Alucard could feel it. This world was no longer testing him. It was preparing to kneel or to burn. The city didn't cheer when the machine fell. It didn't scream either. Manhattan watched in stunned silence as the wreckage burned, smoke rising in pillars that blotted out the stars. The last thing Vought had built to scare the world lay dead in the street, torn open like a discarded toy. Whatever faith still existed in systems, safeguards, and control bled outright there with it. Homelander felt that silence like pressure on his skull. He hovered just above the street, fists clenched so tightly his hands shook, eyes locked on Alucard standing atop the ruined machine. Every instinct he had screamed at him to attack, to reassert dominance, to remind the world who he was. But another instinct, older and quieter, told him the truth. He wasn't the apex anymore. He was being tolerated. That thought cracked something fundamental inside him. He launched himself upward in a sonic boom, slamming into Alucard with everything he had left. The impact shattered what remained of the machine beneath them, sending both figures tumbling through smoke and fire. They crashed through the upper floors of a nearby tower, tearing it open from the inside as they fell, trading blows amid collapsing steel and concrete. This wasn't a spectacle anymore. It was ugly. Homelander fought like a man drowning, every punch wild, every blast fueled by terror rather than confidence. Alucard met him blow for blow, but the difference was clear now. His regeneration lagged slightly, shadows snapping back into place with visible effort. The machine had cost him something real. Homelander noticed. He pressed the advantage mercilessly, heat vision burning longer, harder, focused on joints and vital points he'd learned through brutal repetition. For the first time since Alucard arrived, damage lingered. Bones took longer to knit. Flesh crawled back instead of snapping into place. Homelander laughed, a broken, hysterical sound, sensing blood in the water. They burst out onto the street again, skidding across wreckage until Homelander drove Alucard through the facade of a bank and into the vault beyond. Steel doors crumpled like foil under their combined weight. Homelander pinned Alucard against the vault wall, heat vision pouring into his chest at point-blank range, refusing to let up. "This is my world," Homelander screamed, voice cracking. "You don't get to take it from me." For several seconds, it almost worked. Alucard's body burned, shadows thinning under the sustained assault, regeneration stalling in places where the heat lingered. Homelander leaned in, eyes wide with manic hope, convinced that if he just kept going, if he just didn't stop, he could end this. Then Alucard grabbed his face. The grip was firm, unyielding, and when Alucard spoke, his voice cut through the noise with terrifying calm. He told Homelander that pain wasn't the same thing as progress. He told him that fear made him predictable. And then, quietly, he asked Homelander if anyone had ever taught him how to lose. The shadows surged. They didn't just wrap around Alucard this time. They poured outward, filling the vault, seeping into the cracks Homelander had burned into him, reinforcing what regeneration alone could not. Alucard headbutted Homelander hard enough to crack the vault wall, then drove him through it, sending both of them tumbling into the street beyond. Homelander hit hard and didn't rise immediately. Above, the clouds churned unnaturally, drawn into a slow spiral centered on Alucard. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself was reacting to the pressure he exerted. People miles away felt it in their chests, a sense that something old and vast was no longer content to stay contained. Butcher watched from cover as Homelander struggled to his knees, blood streaming down his face. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. He'd dreamed of seeing Homelander broken. The reality was different. This wasn't justice. It was collapse. Homelander finally stood, swaying, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. He looked around at the ruined city, at the people watching him with fear instead of awe, at Alucard waiting patiently in the street. Something inside him snapped completely. He screamed and flew straight up, vanishing into the clouds. Alucard didn't chase him. That choice rippled outward more violently than any punch. Homelander's retreat wasn't strategic. It was instinctual. The god of this world had fled his own city, and everyone had seen it. Phones recorded the empty sky where he'd vanished. The silence afterward was deafening. Alucard looked up for a long moment, then turned away. He began walking. Not out of the city, deeper into it. Power grids flickered as he passed. Alarms died. Secure doors unlocked themselves. The systems that ran Manhattan responded to him like a body reacting to a new heartbeat. Vought's remaining command centers went dark one by one, personnel evacuating as fast as they could, abandoning terminals and classified data in their rush to escape. In a distant, fortified location, Homelander crashed through the roof of a secure Vought facility and collapsed to his knees. He stared at his reflection in a reinforced window, barely recognizing the bloodied, shaking figure looking back at him. For the first time, there was no handler telling him what to do next. He was alone. Back in the city, Alucard stopped at the edge of a ruined avenue and looked toward the horizon, sensing the shift in global attention. Satellites tracked him constantly now. Militaries repositioned. Emergency councils convened. The gods of this world were breaking, one by one. And the world had to decide what replaced them. By morning, there was no such thing as private airspace. Satellites tracked Manhattan in overlapping grids, feeds bouncing between military commands, intelligence agencies, and emergency councils that hadn't agreed on anything this quickly in decades. Borders became irrelevant when a single figure had just dismantled a corporate god, a city-scale weapon, and the world's most famous superhero in less than 48 hours. Whatever authority remained on the planet was converging on one question. Could this be stopped? Alucard felt the attention like a low hum beneath his skin. He moved through the city as dawn crept in, walking streets that looked like war zones, stepping over abandoned weapons and shattered vehicles. Survivors watched him from doorways and broken windows, too exhausted for fear, too aware to mistake him for a savior. He didn't acknowledge them. He wasn't here for approval. Deep beneath the Atlantic, A coalition council convened in a hardened facility built to survive nuclear exchange. Generals, intelligence directors, and heads of state argued in clipped voices, images of Manhattan looping behind them. Vought representatives were present in name only, reduced to observers stripped of authority. Their last trump card had burned in the street. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. If Alucard could not be controlled, he would be removed. Not with force alone, but with finality. They activated a contingency that predated Vought itself, a protocol designed for entities that broke the known limits of biology and physics. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was an event, one that would rewrite the space it occupied. The launch sequence began quietly, buried under layers of redundancy, aimed not at Manhattan, but at the space Alucard was expected to occupy next. Alucard stopped walking. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly, and smiled. Whatever they were preparing, he could feel it pressing against the world like a held breath. This was different from missiles and machines. This was fear given form. Above him, the clouds split. A column of light descended without sound, pinning Alucard in place as gravity twisted and folded inward. The street beneath him warped, asphalt flowing like liquid toward the center of the beam. Buildings groaned as forces they weren't designed to endure pulled at their foundations. This wasn't an attack meant to kill. It was meant to erase. Alucard's body tore apart instantly, shadows screaming as they were dragged into the distortion. Regeneration tried to assert itself and failed, pieces reforming only to be pulled apart again, faster each time. For the first time since his arrival, Alucard did not laugh. He dug in. The shadows thickened, anchoring themselves to the city, spreading outward into cracks and ruins, binding him to the world that was trying to reject him. The beam intensified, the air screaming now as space itself protested. Alucard's form flickered, stability breaking down as the event escalated. Miles away, Billy Butcher watched the sky twist from a makeshift command post, teeth clenched. Huey stood beside him, knuckles white. They didn't know what the world was throwing at Alucard, but they could see the cost. For the first time, the monster looked like it might lose. And somewhere else entirely, Homelander watched from a fortified Vought bunker, staring at the same feeds. He felt a twisted surge of relief and fury. If Alucard died, the world might still need him. If Alucard lived, he didn't finish the thought. Back in Manhattan, the event reached critical mass. The beam collapsed inward, space folding like paper, dragging everything at its center into nothingness. Alucard was pulled completely free of the street, his connection to the city tearing loose. The shadows screamed as one, snapping back into him as his form was compressed into a single, burning point. For a heartbeat, Alucard was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the point expanded. Darkness exploded outward, shattering the containment of the event in a violent backlash that ripped through the beam and sent it spiraling into collapse. Alucard reappeared at the epicenter, body incomplete, regeneration struggling, shadows ragged and thrashing wildly. He dropped to one knee, one hand pressed to the ground as if steadying himself against a world that no longer wanted him. He had survived. Barely. The Coalition's feeds went dark one by one as the event failed catastrophically, systems overloading under forces they couldn't predict. The last authority the world had tried to assert had broken against something it couldn't define. Alucard stood slowly, posture different now. He was still powerful, still dangerous, but the cost was written all over him. Whatever limit he had, they had brushed it. He looked toward the horizon, sensing the man who had fled, the one thread still connecting this world's old order to its future collapse. Homelander. The choice was clear now. This couldn't end with structures or symbols. It had to end with the lie itself. Alucard stepped into the shadows and vanished, leaving behind a city that had just watched the world's last authority fail. And far away, Homelander felt something cold settle in his gut. Homelander had always believed that if the world ever truly turned against him, there would be warning. A meeting, a briefing, a handler easing him into the idea that public perception needed recalibration. That was how it had always worked. Problems were framed, narratives were adjusted, violence was edited into something palatable. What he felt now, alone in the reinforced silence of the bunker, was different. This wasn't disapproval. It was abandonment. The screens in the room showed static where Vought command feeds used to be. Emergency channels looped evacuation notices and international advisories that didn't mention him at all. The world was moving forward without waiting for his approval, and that terrified him more than Alucard ever had. He paced like a caged animal, fists clenching and unclenching, replaying the night over and over in his head, searching for the moment it all went wrong. He told himself Alucard had cheated, that the machine should have won, that the world had panicked too quickly. The lie didn't hold. Above the bunker, the air shifted. Homelander felt it before any alarm sounded, the same pressure he'd felt in Manhattan when the shadows had thickened and the rules had started to bend. He looked up slowly, dread crawling up his spine, and the ceiling collapsed inward as if struck by a falling star. Alucard landed in the center of the room, in a storm of debris. The shadows around him were thinner than before, frayed at the edges, but his presence still filled the space like a gravitational field. He straightened, surveying the bunker with open disdain, red eyes settling on Homelander with quiet certainty. There was no crowd here, no cameras, no one left to perform for. Homelander screamed and attacked immediately. He slammed into Alucard with everything he had, driving him through walls, tearing through reinforced corridors and blast doors as they tumbled deeper into the facility. The fight was brutal and close, stripped of spectacle, reduced to fists and rage in tight spaces meant to survive bombs. Homelander hit harder than ever, desperation sharpening his strength into something almost focused. Alucard took it and answered. He countered with precision now, conserving movement, targeting joints, exploiting patterns Homelander couldn't break out of. The shadows reinforced him where regeneration lagged, snapping back into place like tendons under strain. Every exchange ended the same way. Homelander driven back, forced to recover, forced to realize he couldn't overwhelm this. They crashed into the bunker's core chamber, a cavernous room lined with Vought's last emergency archives. Screens shattered as they collided, data spilling uselessly into the air. Homelander pinned Alucard against a reactor housing, heat vision flaring, pouring power into him until the metal behind Alucard glowed white-hot. Alucard grimaced, regeneration stalling again under the sustained assault. Homelander saw it and smiled. "This is it," he gasped, half laughing. "You're not invincible, you're just another thing that bleeds." Alucard reached up slowly, fingers closing around Homelander's wrist, stopping the beam by force alone. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost gentle. He told Homelander that bleeding wasn't weakness, pretending not to was. He pulled Homelander in and drove his forehead into his face. The blow echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Homelander staggered back, disoriented, blood pouring freely now. Alucard didn't press immediately. He watched Homelander steady himself, watched him reach for the performance one last time. Homelander straightened, wiped blood from his mouth and smiled again. He told Alucard the world needed him, that people were afraid and needed a symbol, that Alucard could destroy everything, but he couldn't replace what Homelander represented. It was the purest lie he'd ever told. Alucard listened patiently, then shook his head. He told Homelander that symbols only mattered while people believed in them, and belief, once broken, never healed the same way. He moved. The shadows surged, not outward, but inward, reinforcing Alucard's form as he struck with a speed Homelander couldn't track anymore. The blows came in rapid succession, each one collapsing resistance, each one stripping away another layer of illusion. Homelander was driven to his knees, then to the ground, body healing slower now under the accumulated damage. Alucard stood over him, looking down at the man who had called himself a god. He didn't kill him. Instead, he reached into the shadows and pulled something out, not a weapon but a presence, a pressure that settled over Homelander's mind like a crushing weight. Memories surfaced unbidden. The lab, the handlers, the applause piped in when no one was watching, the emptiness he'd never been able to fill. Homelander screamed, clutching his head, as the lie he'd built his identity on collapsed from the inside. Alucard stepped back, shadows receding slightly. He told Homelander this was mercy. Death would have been simpler. Living with the truth would be the real punishment. Above them, the bunker's final failsafes began to trigger, reactors overloading as systems tried to erase themselves. Alucard turned away, walking toward the light filtering in from the collapsed ceiling. Behind him, Homelander lay broken, not dead but undone. The world would find him like this. And when it did, there would be no story left to tell that could save him. The world did not wake up to applause. It woke up to confirmation. By the time emergency teams reached the bunker, Homelander was still alive, buried beneath collapsed concrete and broken screens, eyes open and unfocused. There was no final battle footage to spin, no heroic last stand to edit into a myth. There was only a man in a torn suit, shaking, whispering to no one as medics pulled him from the wreckage. Someone filmed it. Someone always did. Vought's response collapsed in under an hour. Executives vanished into custody or exile. Stock markets froze trading on Vought subsidiaries as governments seized assets under emergency powers that no one bothered to contest. The seven were quietly placed under protective detainment, a phrase that fooled no one. Without Homelander, there was no leverage left to argue immunity. The age of corporate gods ended with paperwork, not explosions. In Manhattan, Alucard stood at the edge of the river as the sun rose fully over the city. His reflection wavered in the water, shadows thinner now, less restless. The world had pushed back harder than he'd expected, hard enough to leave scars he would carry longer than he cared to admit. But the outcome was clear. This world would not forget him. Military assets remained on high alert, but no one fired. Not because they couldn't, but because they finally understood the cost. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. Escalation no longer guaranteed control. Alucard had broken that assumption permanently. Billy Butcher watched the news from a commandeered apartment, arms crossed, jaw tight. Huey sat beside him in silence. The footage replayed Homelander's extraction again and again, stripped of music, stripped of narrative. Just a broken man being carried away. "It's over," Huey said, not triumphantly but with exhaustion. Butcher didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, toward the river, where a distant red shape stood unmoving against the morning light. "No," he said finally, "it's finished." The difference mattered. Alucard felt the eyes on him long before anyone approached. He turned as a small delegation arrived at the waterfront, unarmed, moving carefully. Diplomats, military observers, people whose job was to speak when violence had failed. They stopped at a respectful distance, waiting. Alucard spoke first. He told them he had no interest in ruling their world, no desire to sit on thrones or issue decrees. He told them he had come because this place had screamed too loudly for too long, because lies stacked high enough eventually attract things that enjoy pulling them down. He told them something else too, something that made several of them pale. He would not stay. This world was fragile in ways it refused to admit, and his presence would only accelerate fractures that were already there. He had proven his point. He had broken the illusion. What came next was their responsibility. One of the delegates asked what would happen if another Homelander rose. Alucard smiled faintly and said then they would deserve what came after. There were no threats in his voice, no promises, just certainty. As he turned away, the shadows gathered around him one last time, thicker than they'd been since the night began, then folded inward. Alucard vanished without spectacle, without sound, leaving behind only ripples in the water and a city that suddenly felt very, very mortal. In the days that followed, the world changed in ways that could not be undone. Superhero programs were dismantled or nationalized under strict oversight. Compound V research was seized and buried under layers of international restriction that no corporation could buy its way through again. The idea of a single figure standing above consequence became politically radioactive overnight. Homelander survived. That, to many, was the cruelest part. He was held in a black site medical facility, powers intact but spirit shattered. Interviews were canceled indefinitely. Every attempt to rehabilitate his image failed before it began. The world had seen behind the curtain, and there was no unseeing it. Children stopped wearing his symbol. Protesters burned it instead. Sometimes, late at night, Homelander screamed. Sometimes he begged for cameras that never came. The city rebuilt slowly. Scars remained, physical and otherwise. Memorials went up not to heroes but to victims whose names had never been spoken on television. The skyline changed, not just in shape but in meaning. People looked up less often now, and when they did, it wasn't with hope. It was with caution. Somewhere beyond the reach of satellites and summoning rituals, Alucard walked on, carrying the weight of another world that had learned too late what monsters were really for. He did not regret it. He never had. This world would remember him not as a savior or a conqueror, but as a reckoning. And in that memory, it would finally learn how dangerous belief could be. The gods were gone. What came next would be human.